if you're going to tell a story, people have to be able to hear your story. And that means going beyond simply narrating what's going on. It means having some sort of talking occurring in your story. If you've got a story and it's just kind of narration, it comes off like a news report. It's boring, uninteresting. Doesn't get people involved, doesn't get people really thinking about your story. You get people talking back and forth, you have dialogue, then something special happens. Then it becomes interesting. If you're just given a talk like a news report, it's more like examples, not really a story. Once you start using dialogue, then you have a story. And examples tell, but stories sell. So if you're going to do dialogue, how do you do dialogue the right way? How do you make sure your dialogue is something that gets people involved, gets people thinking, gets people interested in what you're saying? What's the most effective way to do dialogue? This is something I've wondered about for a while, for a long time. How do you tell stories? How do you really use that dialogue effectively? And recently I discovered Craig Valentine, world champion speaker Craig Valentine. He talks about different types of dialogue and the importance of those different types of dialogue. If you don't understand the different types of dialogue, then your story just doesn't really go anywhere. It turns into that news report. You may think you're doing dialogue, but you're really not. It's not effective, it's not interesting, and your audience just considers it one big snooze fest. If you are using dialogue and using it well, and using the different types of dialogue, your story becomes interesting, engaging, pulls audience in, gets them excited, gets them interested in what you have to say, what you're talking about. And that's the power of effective dialogue, and making that dialogue work. So you're going to learn about that dialogue. You're going to learn the effectiveness of that dialogue, different ways that dialogue works. You're going to discover how to use dialogue and where. And what's really the nature of dialogue? How does dialogue really work? You're going to find out all of those things as I step you through the basis of dialogue according to world champion speaker Craig Valentine. And at the end of this brief presentation, you fully understand dialogue, how to use dialogue, where to use dialogue, different types of dialogue, and you probably find a few types of dialogue you never thought about. Once you understand, so effective for getting that audience interconnection. So I'm going to step you through 3 different types of dialogue. 3 different types. One type you probably know pretty well. One type you're probably very, very aware of. Another type you may not think about that much. But if you use it, your stories become more effective and more interesting. And a final type you probably never think about, but will really, really help you interconnect with your audience. And when you learn these 3 types, you put them all together, you're going to have a pretty powerful, pretty effective story. It's all about understanding these 3 types, how they're different, but also how they work together in the story. So now you're going to learn the 3 types of dialogue, and it begins with the first type of dialogue, the one you probably already are familiar with. Now the first type of dialogue you probably already know, may not use. So many speakers don't even use the first type of dialogue. They get so caught up in narrating things. It just seems easier. And instead of really telling what goes on, they use that narration sort of thing. They don't even realize they're doing it. Maybe you've done the same thing. Maybe you're narrating and not even realizing it. When you do that, you just don't connect with your story. Once you start using the first type of dialogue, suddenly your story comes alive, becomes more interesting, becomes more engaged in the audience. It pulls them in, it gets them going, gets them excited, keeps them interested, keeps them involved in what you have to say. First type of dialogue, when you use it, it's very powerful. And it's a thing that turns your story from just being a news report into being a real living, breathing story. And the first type of dialogue is external dialogue. Now, you might be thinking, Tim, what other type of dialogue is there? Isn't all dialogue external? Well, no, it's not. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There is external dialogue. And external dialogue is probably what you're thinking of most of the time when you think of dialogue. You think of a conversation. Something like that. That make sense? Conversation. Somebody says something, the other person says another person, another thing. So, Bob says something to Sam, Sam says something to Bob. Bob says, Sam, you're starting to annoy me. Bob says, Sam, why am I annoying you? Well, you're just starting to bother me, Sam, that's all. Dialogue. Dialogue back and forth. External dialogue. Called external dialogue because it's out there. It's external. It's out there in the world. Something you easily can hear, easily are aware of. And the purpose of that external dialogue is it builds the conflict. Gets the conflict going. So if people talk back and forth, the conflict escalates, things get more interesting, more exciting, and you start to get your story coming together. That's external dialogue. Now what many speakers do is they kind of narrate. And Sam said that he was upset, and I said that I was angry, and Sam said he was going to do something, and the problem with narrating is it keeps the listener distant from the story. It's like the speaker feels they have to get between the listener and the story. It's like, okay, I'm not going to allow you between you and my story. I'm just going to keep you back. And it's just not effective. A simple way to tell, to know when you're narrating as opposed to telling a story, is just look for the word that. If you said, he said that, that's not a direct quotation. That's a narration. But if you said, he said, and then you tell what he said, that then is an actual dialogue. So, Sam said that he was angry. That's a narration. Sam said, I'm angry. That's the beginning of a dialogue. Now, if he says it to somebody, there you go. Sam said, Bob, I'm really angry with you. Bob said, Sam, why are you angry with me? You're the one that made the mistake. See? Begins the dialogue, the talking back and forth, and it builds the conflict. So much more effective than just narrating things. So that first type of dialogue is external dialogue. Now that first type isn't the only type. It's another type of dialogue many, if not most speakers, completely forget about. Even after you have external dialogue, that's not all the dialogue there is. And most speakers think that's all the dialogue there is. External dialogue. Okay, I didn't have dialogue. fine, I'll put in some external dialogue. That'll be good enough. It's not good enough. If you can add in this second type of dialogue, dialogue is much better off. It's the sort of dialogue that most speakers don't even think about. And yet, it's there. Somewhere in your presentation, somewhere in your story, this type of dialogue is there. If you just work to get it in there, to access it, to make it work. And yet, most speakers just don't use it. If you do use it, it's so very effective. Especially if you have a speech where there really isn't anybody else in the speech. Then this second type of dialogue is very, very useful. And the second type of dialogue is internal dialogue. Internal dialogue. This is a sort of dialogue where you give an audience a chance to get inside your head, to really hear what you're thinking. It's simple, it's easy, yet most speakers don't bother doing it. For whatever reason. Maybe because they think it sounds weird. They think, this just sounds weird. Here's what internal dialogue is. Just get the audience a chance to get inside your head. So instead of saying something like, I thought that I was upset. I thought that I was getting angry. Is you know, once you hear that word that, it's like, okay, well that's not real dialogue. You change that into, and I thought, I'm upset. And I'm getting angry. That's the difference. That's internal dialogue. Gives a chance for the audience to hear, not just a news report, I thought that I was upset. Get a chance to actually hear that anger, that upsetness in your voice. And it's that upsetness that carries the dialogue through. It makes things interesting, that gets you connecting with your audience. Especially useful, as I said, when you've got some sort of story where there really isn't anybody else but you. If you're the only person in your story, you may be thinking, I can't do dialogue, I'm the only person in my story. But you can. You can do internal dialogue. Tremendously effective. Just to get the audience a chance to get inside your head. Once you do that sort of dialogue, then the story comes alive for your audience. They get interested. They think, oh, okay, there's something here. And, as you know, dialogue builds the conflict. So if you want to build your conflict, dialogue's the greatest way to do it. You may think, oh, don't have anybody else, I can't have any dialogue. No, it just means you can't have external dialogue. But you can have plenty of internal dialogue. And that will build, grow, and develop that conflict. The internal dialogue can make that conflict grow. Now, you might be thinking, Tim, you're talking about dialogue, right? But you said the thing about dialogue is between two people. So you can't have internal dialogue because there's nobody on the other side. You're just talking to yourself. There's nobody else there. But there is somebody else there. The audience is there. And the audience always answers. Every time you're going through that internal dialogue, the audience answers. So if you say something like, I thought, I'm upset! The audience is thinking, whoa, what's he upset about? Hope it's not me. Audience always answers. You give your part of internal dialogue. The audience will respond with what they're thinking going through their heads. Something will go through your audience's head, and that's the dialogue. Notice it's not a dialogue out loud. It's It's not just like an external dialogue talking back and forth, but it is a dialogue with the audience. As you watch your audience, you look at your audience, you can see that dialogue happening. Every time you have a piece of internal dialogue, you can see out there in the audience, it's connecting. They're thinking. There's something going through your audience's mind. Everyone out there has something going through their head as they're responding to your internal dialogue. So we talked about external dialogue, talked about internal dialogue. The final type of dialogue is probably the type of dialogue the speakers use absolutely the least. And if most speakers don't know how to use internal dialogue, just about every speaker doesn't know how to use this type of dialogue. Because only a few speakers who are really into the craft use this one. Perhaps because, like internal dialogue, they think it sounds strange or weird. Perhaps it's because they simply don't think about it. Perhaps for some other reason. Whatever the reason, many speakers don't use this type of dialogue. And if you do use this type of dialogue, you discover you connect with the audience almost instantly. Because the audience knows that you get them. Create that deep audience connection maybe you've always wanted to have. It's a simple method of dialogue, it's a powerful method of dialogue, but it does require you thinking about things a little bit differently. And that type of dialogue is audience dialogue. Audience dialogue. Remember, I said that the audience always answers. I mentioned that in internal dialogue, the audience will answer in their own mind. With audience dialogue, you're speaking directly to the audience. There are different ways to use audience dialogue. In this case, it's not a matter of you're speaking between two people. It's not a matter of you're speaking inside your head. In this case, you're speaking directly to the audience. That's audience dialogue. Use the word you. So if you say, when you're speaking to an audience, speak directly to the audience. That's audience dialogue. In fact, a lot of the speech has that audience dialogue in it. Now, while that's audience dialogue, and that kind of goes all the way through whatever presentation you're happening, it isn't necessarily the sort of dialogue that fits in the storytelling mode. But there is a type of audience dialogue that really does fit very well with storytelling. That's when you create a dialogue with the audience, and a dialogue in this case of what the audience is thinking. So I said the audience always answers. In this case, you tell the audience what they're answering. That's audience dialogue. So, if I say, you might be thinking, Tim, that just sounds weird. The audience always answers. What the heck does that mean? That's an example of audience dialogue. I'm talking directly to you and telling you, the audience always answers, and giving it thoughts about what you have going on through your head. This isn't about an internal dialogue I'm having, it's about what you're thinking. And if you can do audience dialogue well, if you do audience dialogue really well, and you do say what's going on in your audience's mind, that creates that instant connection. Because when you can tell the audience what they're thinking, they know you get them. They know you understand. They know you know them. And just as when you know somebody, and somebody really knows you well, you naturally come closer to them, so your audience will come closer to you. Audience dialogue is so powerful. And the simplest way to start out is saying, you might be thinking, and then use a little bit of dialogue indicating what the audience might be thinking. In this case, the dialogue here is the finishing up of the dialogue. You're doing things up here, the audience is answering, and you're interpreting that answer. Audience dialogue is tremendously effective because it helps let the audience know that you understand them, you get them. So you can say, you might be thinking, wow, Tim, that'd be really useful if the audience can understand what I'm saying and really get it, and I can connect in deep with them and understand what they're saying. I can really use that in my speeches, and especially in my stories. If that's what you're thinking, then audience dialogue is tremendously effective, tremendously powerful. And by doing this, by making this connection, by saying you might be thinking, you will be doing something that very few speakers do. You'll be doing something that just puts you in a whole different category of speaker. And the audience will deeply connect with you, deeply understand you, and it will all come together with you in the audience. And using this third and final type of dialogue, along with the other two types of dialogue, really help you, the audience, connect. For today, you've learned that one of the best ways to connect with your audience is dialogue. You discovered there are 3 different types of dialogue. Many will know of external dialogue. External dialogue, first type of dialogue, very simple. It's just where you're talking to someone else. For instance, if I'm having a conversation with Bob, I could say something like, I was talking with Bob. Bob is a experienced presenter, middle-aged, brown hair, nice guy. Known him for quite a long time. I said, Bob, it's really important to start learning how to do dialogue. Bob said, Tim, why should I bother? Why should I bother with dialogue? Bob, you got to bother with dialogue because dialogue is where you're going to connect with your audience. Well, Tim, why do you think that's the best way to connect with the audience? That's dialogue. That's dialogue where things are going back and forth, and there's some sort of sense of that external dialogue. There's one person and another person. In this case, Bob and me, talking back and forth. Many speakers are aware of that type of dialogue. May not use it, but at least you're aware of it. That's fine. But there's a second type of dialogue you discovered today, internal dialogue. And that's simply where you talk to yourself. And you let the audience hear what you're saying in your head. Also a very powerful type of dialogue, and many speakers do not use or even know about internal dialogue. For instance, and I thought, Bob is so stubborn. He just won't follow along with anything. I give him these great ideas, and he just doesn't pay any attention to them. That's internal dialogue. Letting the audience hear what's going on inside my head. Internal dialogue is very powerful because it helps the audience connect in. And the audience always answers. You might think internal dialogue has no answer. Dialogue, how can it be dialogue? It's got to go back and forth with somebody else. In this case, with internal dialogue, the somebody else is the audience. For all the internal dialogue going up here, the audience is thinking something in response to it. And then finally, audience dialogue. Probably the least used of all the different types of dialogue, and one of the most powerful. Audience dialogue. For instance, I say, you might be thinking, Tim, why are you pushing up Bob so much to get this different type of dialogue? Why is it so important? That's audience dialogue. It's where the speaker says what the audience is thinking. And if you get what your audience is thinking and you can put it into words they're actually thinking, that's a strong connection. Then the audience has no question that you get them. You understand them. You're connected. You're definitely connecting. Extremely powerful form of dialogue. Now, you might think, Tim, why bother? Too much work, too much effort. I'm just going to do whatever I'm doing up there, no big deal. And that's fine. But if you do that, you don't connect with your audience. Don't connect with the audience, you don't use dialogue, then it just becomes much more of a narration and not really a story at all, not interesting. If you use dialogue, the three types of dialogue, external, internal, and audience, you'll connect with your audience like never before. Suddenly you have the audience in the palm of your hand. It'll be simple, it'll be easy, and it'll happen. And when you start doing it, you'll be large and in charge. You'll take charge of the situation. You'll be in charge of the audience and in charge of your presentation. You won't be wasting people's time. You'll be wasting your own time because you'll connect to them quickly, easily, efficiently, and they'll get the sense right at the beginning that you're not wasting their time. This is something they need to pay attention to. Simple process. External, internal, and audience. Three types of dialogue. Very simple. And you start to enjoy being up there more. As you connect with the audience, you feel the audience connecting with you. It's just a great, great feeling. So as you're developing yourself as a speaker and you're moving from giving news reports to telling stories, just remember, use the dialogue, make that audience connection.